Hi, in this video we will continue our exploration of the melting furnace in Hamburg data that is currently saved in TimescaleDB. In my last video I mentioned that there were two ways to query this data from TimescaleDB via the UMH stack. The first one was using a Grafana object to display this data visually in Grafana. This will be a topic for our next video. And the second way that we will explore in this video involves the service Factoryinsight. So Factoryinsight is a service developed by the UMH itself, and its main goal is to expose TimescaleDB via a RESTful API. This means that if you have a program that consumes data over an application interface, you can obtain the data from the database using this REST API. The documentation, as always, is on the website, and there's a lot of interesting things you can obtain from the data, including the OEE. So if you would send a GET request over HTTP to TimescaleDB with the customer, location, asset, and then give it two timestamps from and to, it will return you the OEE. So that's pretty clever. Right. So in this video, the first part, we will quickly explore how to configure Factoryinsight, because there are some things we have to do to get it up and running. And in the second part, we will really look at some examples of how we can send HTTP requests using Postman and see what data we can get back from our melting furnace in Hamburg. Right. So if we look at Factoryinsight, we have to realize that this is not a service that we can access by default from outside the cluster. What do I mean by this? If you look at the documentation here by services that are exposed via the load balancer, we see that we have the database, so TimescaleDB, the Kafka console, Grafana, Node-RED. These are all things that we can just navigate to with our web browser by going to the IP of our UMH deployment, so in my case the Flatcar VM, and going to the port / the correct name of the service. This will not work by default for Factoryinsight because it's not exposed by default. It's not written in this list. This means that we have to expose it ourselves somehow. There's two ways of doing this. Given that Factoryinsight is a cluster IP service, we can either create its own load balancer by changing the configuration in OpenLens or UMH lens. This is the recommended way for production services because the load balancer ensures a stable connection. But to keep the video really focused on Factoryinsight, I will just use post forwarding because it's much quicker and much easier. This is not something that you should do on a production deployment, however. So to enable port forwarding in the OpenLens, we navigate to our services in OpenLens. So I'm now opening the program and connecting to the UMH cluster. Okay, let's go to the network tab and look at our services. So the one we are looking for is called Factoryinsight. If I go ahead and search for the name Factory, I see that the service here is running on this internal IP that we cannot simply reach from our machine. And it's running on port 80. And what we can do now in OpenLens is to just forward this port to any random port on our computer. And we will also open the final result in our browser to see if the connection has been successful. So I'm now essentially binding an internal port 80 from the virtual machine to a random port number on my computer. Let's go to the port forwarding, and indeed we see that now on localhost on port 35293, I get a message online which indicates that the service is now running and it's reachable from my host. Now in the next part of the video, let's look at how we can request some data using an HTTP GET request using Postman. So I open my Postman program. And Postman is really just a GUI that allows you to send get requests and inspect the result in a convenient way. Let's create a new request. It's going to be HTTP. For the URL, I'm going to paste essentially what I saw copied in the browser. So localhost, just my computer, and then the random port that we got assigned by the UMH lens, which is bound to port 80 of Factoryinsight running inside the Flatcar virtual machine. Right, let's look again at the way Factoryinsight is documented. The URL that we have to use will be the host /API/v1. And if we want to obtain information about a client, in our case the default client named Factoryinsight, we have to add the client's name at the end of the URL. So essentially we are testing this GET request. Now if I execute this GET request, you will see that we are not authorized because we have forgotten to add the secrets to configure the authentication to connect to our database or to this service. And the documentation states that to authenticate against this API, we can use the secrets stored in the Factoryinsight secret in OpenLens. Now I still have OpenLens here. So if I now go to config and then in secrets, we indeed see that we can find the Factoryinsight secret here. And the API key is the one that we will use, and it consists of the word basic and then a very long string. And I've opened this tab here just to explain a bit how this authentication works. In a nutshell, we are using basic authentication, which is in fact a base64 encoding of the username : password string. This already has been done for us. So this very long string can be decoded in the username and password by the service itself. So to use this authentication, what we have to do is we have to create a header entry where the key is authorization. So let's go ahead and paste this here. And then the value should be the secret from Grafana. Pasting it here, and there we go. So now I have the authentication configured as well. We have the correct URL. So let's now see if we can get an input from our GET request. And indeed, we see that for this client, by sending this HTTP request, we obtain, in my case, the 4 locations where this client has his assets. Let's explore the API a bit further. We have tested this first GET request. There's a number of more requests we can do. For example, instead of just checking the customer, we can inspect a certain location by adding a new path to the URL. We can say, let's look at our location in Hamburg. And indeed, we see that in Hamburg, we have our melting furnace. If I now go to the melting furnace, we see what kind of objects we have for it. So it's a pretty long list of all kinds of things we have available. Now, most of these things will not work. For instance, the OEE will give me an error message because I haven't configured. First of all, I'm not sending the right parameters. And secondly, I haven't really configured the OEE calculation for the melting furnace. Because recall, we only have in Node-RED the process value. Right, so that's it for this video. To quickly recap, there's 2 ways to query data from TimescaleDB from the UMH. The first one we didn't discuss and involves Grafana. That's for our next video. What we discussed in this video was the second approach using Factoryinsight, which was an API, a RESTful API that allows to obtain data and certain information about your assets or process values over HTTP. Now, in order to make use of Factoryinsight, we had to do 2 things. We had to authorize ourselves using the secret provided in the UMH lens or the open lens. And we also had to somehow expose Factoryinsight to the outside of our virtual machine, either through a load balancer, which we didn't do, or via port forwarding that we did. So I guess in the next video, we will explore the Grafana way of looking at the data.